The red and gold-striped canvas tent collapsed inward like a dying breath, its support poles snapping with the sharp crack of breaking bones. By dawn on October 13, 1898, not a single soul remained to explain why Bellwether's grand traveling circus had vanished from the remote hollow they called Blood Creek, leaving behind only empty wagons and the lingering smell of sawdust mixed with something far more sinister. This disappearance would become one of Appalachian folklore's most enduring mysteries, a case that baffled investigators for over a century. The morning mist rolled thick through the West Virginia hills, carrying the scent of dying leaves and cold earth, while dew beaded on canvas that still held the warmth of yesterday's crowd. Locals who ventured to the campsite found breakfast fires still smoldering, coffee pots warm to the touch, and performer costumes laid out as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. Before we descend deeper into this mountain mystery, I want to know, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in local records and family stories for over 100 years. Bellwether's grand traveling circus had arrived in Blood Creek Hollow 3 days prior, their painted wagons winding down the narrow mountain trail like colorful serpents navigating between towering pines. The troupe numbered exactly 27 souls: performers, laborers, animal handlers, and Silas Bellwether himself, a man whose handlebar mustache and checkered vest had become legendary throughout small towns from Kentucky to Pennsylvania. They'd been touring the Appalachian region for 8 years, bringing magic to isolated communities where entertainment arrived as rarely as store-bought goods. The hollow got its name from the rust-red creek that wound through its center, stained by iron deposits that made the water look like diluted blood in certain light. Local families, the Morrises, the Blackwoods, the Coulters, had farmed these steep slopes for 3 generations, scratching out hardscrabble lives from soil that seemed more rock than earth. When word spread that a circus had made camp, folks traveled from homesteads scattered across 20 square miles to witness wonders they'd only heard whispered about in church gossip. The shows ran Tuesday through Thursday night. Children pressed against rope barriers, wide-eyed, as Marie Dubois walked her tightrope 40 feet above the ground without a net. Men cheered when strongman Otto Krause lifted a full-grown mule over his head, holding it steady while the beast kicked frantically at empty air. Women gasped behind their hands when Madame Zelda claimed to speak with spirits of the departed, calling out names and personal details that made more than one widow weep openly. But it was the final act that people remembered most vividly. Bellwether himself would take center ring, his voice booming across the tent as he introduced what he called the Cabinet of Mysteries, a painted wooden box ornate enough for European royalty. His assistant, a pale young woman known only as Luna, would step inside while Bellwether spun the cabinet slowly, allowing the audience to verify its solid construction. When he opened it moments later, Luna had vanished completely, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone that made children think of lightning storms. From the Braxton County Recorder, October 9, 1898. The Bellwether Circus has established temporary residence in Blood Creek Hollow. Local attendance reported as exceptional. No incidents of note. Thursday night's show ended at 11:30 p.m. to thunderous applause from nearly 200 spectators. Families loaded into wagons and began the long rides back to their homesteads, lantern light bobbing through darkness as they navigated treacherous mountain paths. The Coulter family, whose farm sat closest to the hollow, reported hearing music and laughter well past midnight, along with sounds they couldn't quite identify, rhythmic drumming mixed with what sounded like chanting in a language none of them recognized. Young Thomas Coulter, age 16, claimed he'd crept close enough to peer through gaps in the canvas around 2 a.m. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his 78 years. The performers had formed a circle in the center ring, their faces painted with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering torchlight. Luna stood in the middle, her arms raised toward something that hung suspended above something Thomas swore moved with its own volition, though he could never adequately describe its shape or substance. The family ignored Thomas's wild tale, attributing it to an overactive imagination fueled by circus excitement. They had their own chores to tend, their own concerns about the coming winter. Mountain folk learned early that survival meant focusing on what you could control, not chasing shadows through the night. They never imagined those shadows were chasing something far more substantial. When Sheriff Benjamin Morris rode down to check on the circus Friday morning, expecting to collect the departure tax Bellwether had promised to pay, he found a scene that defied rational explanation. Every wagon remained exactly where it had been positioned 3 days earlier, but they stood empty as abandoned coffins. Tent stakes had been pulled, canvas folded, equipment packed with military precision, yet not a single human being remained to explain who had done the packing or where everyone had gone. The circus animals, 3 horses, 2 mules, and a tired old bear named Augustus, stood untethered but hadn't wandered more than 50 feet from their usual positions. They seemed nervous, shifting weight from hoof to hoof, ears pricked forward as if listening for sounds only they could detect. Augustus, normally aggressive when strangers approached, cowered in the corner of his cage despite the door hanging wide open. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what Sheriff Morris discovered in Bellwether's private wagon. The strongbox containing the week's receipts sat untouched, still locked, holding nearly $300 more money than most local families saw in 5 years. Bellwether's personal effects remained neatly arranged: gold pocket watch, fine leather boots, even his signature checkered vest hanging on a wooden peg. No sign of struggle, no evidence of theft, only absence where presence should have been. What kind of force could make 27 people vanish so completely that they left behind their most precious possessions? And why did the animals refuse to leave, as if they knew something terrible awaited beyond the hollow's protective embrace? The answer lay buried in local history, in stories the mountain families kept locked away like shameful secrets, stories about what really lived in these ancient hills long before any circus ever thought to make them home. The screech of iron against stone echoed through Blood Creek Hollow as Sheriff Morris pried open the last of the circus wagons, his hands trembling despite the October chill. What he found inside defied every rational explanation a lawman could offer. Costumes folded with geometric precision, makeup arranged in perfect rows, and personal belongings organized as if their owners planned to return any moment. This wasn't the first time something had vanished in these particular hills, though the mountain families had grown skilled at forgetting inconvenient truths. Morris knew the local stories, passed down through 3 generations of whispered warnings. His own grandfather had spoken of the Cherokee who once claimed these ridges as sacred hunting grounds, before the Indian Removal Act of 1830 drove them westward on what history would remember as the Trail of Tears. But the Cherokee had left behind more than just arrowheads and pottery shards. They'd left warnings carved into certain trees, symbols that supposedly marked places where the boundary between worlds grew thin. The oldest residents remembered different disappearances. In 1871, a surveying team from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had vanished while mapping potential routes through the hollow. 5 men, 2 horses, and a wagon full of expensive equipment gone without trace. The railroad company sent investigators who found the horses wandering loose near the creek, their reins cut cleanly as if with a sharp blade, but no sign of human presence remained. Ezra Blackwood, now pushing 80, recalled his father speaking of earlier incidents. A family of German immigrants in 1856 seeking farmland deeper in the mountains. A traveling preacher in 1843 who'd claimed these hills harbored ungodly influences and vowed to cleanse them with prayer and fire. A group of Confederate deserters in 1864 who'd used the hollow as a hiding place during the final months of the war. All vanished, all forgotten by anyone who valued their reputation for sanity. The Cherokee warning spoke of something they called the hungry place, a location where the earth itself possessed an appetite for human souls. They'd marked certain boundaries with carved symbols, creating what their shamans described as a spiritual quarantine zone. White settlers had dismissed these markings as primitive superstition, clearing the symbols away to make room for farms and homesteads. From the Diary of Jeremiah Morris, 1873, found Pa's surveying notes in the attic. He drew maps of Cherokee carvings before settlers cleared them. The symbols form a perfect circle around what we now call Blood Creek. Pa wrote that Cherokee elders warned him never to camp inside the circle after dark. Sheriff Morris studied these family records by lamplight, trying to understand what connected the Circus disappearance to earlier incidents. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Every vanishing occurred during periods when the barrier between seasons felt thinnest, late October, when autumn surrendered to winter's approach. Every incident involved groups rather than individuals, as if whatever lurked in the hollow preferred multiple victims to solitary prey. But the circus was different. Previous disappearances had been quiet affairs, noticed only after days or weeks had passed. This time, witnesses existed. The Coulter family had heard strange sounds well into Thursday night. Thomas Coulter claimed to have seen impossible things happening inside the tent. For the first time, someone had observed the process, rather than just discovering its aftermath. Morris questioned Thomas again, pressing for details the boy might have overlooked or deliberately omitted. The teenager's story remained consistent. Performers arranged in a circle, faces painted with unknown symbols. Luna standing in the center with arms raised toward something suspended above. But when Morris asked about this suspended object, Thomas grew pale and stammered about shapes that hurt to remember, geometries that didn't follow natural laws. "It moved like smoke," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible above autumn wind rattling the windows. "But smoke don't have teeth." The sheriff dismissed this as adolescent imagination until he visited the abandoned campsite again and noticed details his first inspection had missed. Burn marks in the center ring formed a perfect circle, though no fire had been reported. The ground within this circle felt different underfoot, softer somehow, as if the earth had been recently disturbed or partially liquefied. When Morris knelt to examine the soil more closely, his fingers came away stained with something that looked like ash, but smelled of copper and ozone. Trees surrounding the campsite showed signs of stress despite the season. Leaves had fallen prematurely, creating bare patches that formed rough geometric patterns when viewed from above. Several large oaks bore fresh scars on their trunks, parallel gouges too deep and too precise to be explained by animal claws or natural weathering. The circus animals remained in the hollow, refusing all attempts at relocation. When Morris tried leading them toward town, they would follow willingly until reaching a specific point on the trail, always the same spot, marked by an ancient stone outcropping, then freeze completely. No amount of coaxing or force could convince them to continue. They would stand trembling, eyes rolled white with terror, until allowed to return to their familiar positions near the abandoned wagons. Augustus the bear exhibited the strangest behavior of all. The animal had spent years performing tricks for crowds, trained to rear up on command and dance to organ music. Now he cowered in his open cage, whimpering like a frightened dog whenever anyone approached the center ring area. On several occasions, Morris observed Augustus staring fixedly at empty air above the burn marks, following the movement of something invisible with his eyes. What did the animals see that human senses couldn't detect? And why did they refuse to abandon the very place where their human companions had vanished? Local families began avoiding the hollow entirely, taking longer routes to town rather than risk passing through the area where red and gold canvas still fluttered from abandoned tent stakes. Children who'd begged their parents for permission to see the circus now woke screaming from nightmares they couldn't adequately describe. Several reported dreams featuring Luna, the pale assistant, calling to them from inside wooden boxes that opened onto starless voids. The Coulter family seriously considered abandoning their farm and moving to relatives in Pennsylvania. Mrs. Coulter had begun seeing figures moving through their cornfield at night, tall, thin shapes that walked with purposes too purposeful to be human. Her husband dismissed these sightings until he glimpsed something similar while checking their livestock one evening. A pale form glided between the barn and the house, moving with liquid grace that defied the laws of physics. But moving meant losing everything they'd built over 20 years of backbreaking labor. Mountain families didn't abandon their land lightly, even when that land seemed determined to swallow them whole. As October deepened toward November, strange sounds began emanating from the hollow after sunset. Not the normal chorus of owls and wind through pine branches, but something that sounded almost like music played on instruments that shouldn't exist. Rhythmic drumming mixed with high, keening notes that made listeners think of voices calling from vast distances. Thomas Coulter swore he could sometimes make out words in that otherworldly symphony, though he couldn't identify the language or explain how he understood their meaning. The voices seemed to be calling for an audience, inviting visitors to witness performances that would never end. The question haunting everyone who'd heard these midnight concerts was simple and terrifying. Were the missing circus performers still giving shows for an audience that existed beyond human perception? Blood pooled in Sheriff Morris's boots as he stepped through the crimson creek that gave the hollow its name, the iron-stained water reflecting his lantern light like liquid fire. 3 days had passed since his initial discovery, and each visit to the abandoned campsite revealed new impossibilities that challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural world. The disappearance had attracted attention from beyond Braxton County's borders, bringing investigators whose credentials impressed and disturbed in equal measure. Dr. Edmund Blackthorne arrived from Charleston on the Monday morning train, claiming to represent the newly formed American Society for Psychical Research. A tall, gaunt man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog secrets, Blackthorne carried instruments Morris had never seen before, brass contraptions with spinning dials, glass tubes filled with mercury, and a camera capable of capturing what he called spectral emanations. His university credentials appeared legitimate, but something in his manner suggested motivations beyond academic curiosity. Accompanying Blackthorne was Agent Samuel Cortez of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by Bellwether's insurance company to investigate the troop's disappearance. Cortez had worked missing persons cases throughout the eastern states, tracking everyone from embezzling bankers to runaway heiresses. He approached the mystery with methodical precision, cataloging evidence with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to separate emotion from observation. The three men began their joint investigation on Tuesday morning, October 18th. Blackthorne immediately focused on the burn marks in the center ring, taking photographs from multiple angles, while his instruments registered readings he recorded in a leather-bound notebook using symbols that resembled no alphabet Morris recognized. Cortez concentrated on the abandoned wagons, searching for clues about the performers' final hours. What they discovered challenged conventional understanding of both human behavior and physical laws. Inside Madame Zelda's wagon, Cortez found her crystal ball still warm to the touch, despite the October chill. Its surface clouded with swirling patterns that moved independently of external light sources. Her tarot cards lay scattered across a small table in what initially appeared to be random disarray, but closer examination revealed they'd been arranged to form a specific pattern, one that seemed to shift subtly whenever observed directly. Blackthorne's instruments detected electromagnetic anomalies concentrated around the center ring, readings that fluctuated in rhythmic patterns resembling a massive heartbeat. The temperature within the burn circle registered 12 degrees warmer than surrounding areas, while his specialized camera captured luminous phenomena invisible to the naked eye, twisted ribbons of light that writhe through the air like living things. From Dr. Blackthorn's field notes, October 18, 1898, atmospheric disturbances suggest dimensional instability. Photographic plates reveal energy patterns consistent with theoretical descriptions of transspatial phenomena. Local magnetic declination varies by 17 degrees within the affected zone. Morris struggled to understand these technical observations, but their implications seemed clear enough. Something unnatural had occurred in Blood Creek Hollow, something that left measurable traces in the physical world. Whether that something originated from earthly or otherworldly sources remained an open question. The investigation team interviewed every local family who'd attended the circus performances, searching for details that might explain the troupe's fate. Most witnesses provided consistent accounts of the shows, describing acts they'd found entertaining, if unremarkable. But several individuals reported disturbing elements the others either hadn't noticed or chose not to remember. Sarah Blackwood, age 24, recalled that Luna's disappearing act during Thursday night's finale had felt different from previous performances. Instead of the usual theatrical flourish, the assistant's vanishing had occurred with unsettling suddenness, accompanied by a sound like distant thunder and a brief dimming of all the torches simultaneously. When Bellwether opened the cabinet moments later to reveal Luna's absence, Sarah claimed she could smell something like burning copper and hear faint voices speaking in harmony from inside the empty box. Her testimony gained credibility when other witnesses confirmed similar sensory details they'd initially dismissed as imagination. The scent of burning metal, the momentary torch dimming, even the harmonic voices, elements that individually seemed insignificant, but collectively suggested the finale involved more than mere stage magic. Young Timothy Morris, the sheriff's own nephew, admitted, under gentle questioning, that he'd glimpsed something troubling during Luna's act. As Bellwether spun the cabinet, Timothy claimed he'd seen through gaps between the wooden slats, and Luna wasn't alone inside. Shadowy figures surrounded her, tall and impossibly thin, with faces that seemed to blur whenever he tried to focus on their features. "They looked hungry," Timothy whispered, his 8-year-old vocabulary struggling with concepts beyond his experience. Like they'd been waiting a long time for something to eat. Agent Cortez documented these accounts with professional skepticism, but privately admitted to Sheriff Morris that he'd encountered similar reports during previous missing persons investigations. Not the supernatural elements, which he attributed to hysteria and suggestion, but the pattern of witnesses initially forgetting disturbing details, only to remember them later under careful questioning. In his experience, such delayed recollections often contained kernels of truth buried beneath layers of psychological self-protection. The circus animals continued exhibiting aberrant behavior. Augustus the bear had stopped eating entirely, despite handlers placing fresh food within easy reach. The horses and mules showed signs of extreme agitation whenever approached after sunset, their eyes rolling white as they backed away from invisible threats. Most disturbing of all, the animals had begun moving in formation during nighttime hours, arranging themselves in the same circular pattern the missing performers had assumed during their final mysterious ritual. Local families reported seeing these animal processions from their windows, though none admitted to venturing outside for closer observation. The creatures would maintain their formation for exactly 3 hours each night, from midnight until 3 a.m., then return to their normal positions as if released from some compulsion. Dr. Blackthorn theorized that the animals served as anchors, maintaining a connection between dimensions, their presence preventing complete closure of whatever portal the circus performers had opened or been pulled through. This explanation struck Morris as elaborate nonsense, but it provided a framework for understanding why the creatures refused to leave the hollow, despite obvious distress. On Thursday night, exactly 1 week after the troupe's disappearance, The investigation team decided to maintain surveillance of the abandoned campsite. They positioned themselves in concealed locations around the hollow's perimeter, equipped with cameras, notebooks, and Blackthorn's mysterious instruments. What they witnessed during the early morning hours would strain their sanity and reshape their understanding of reality itself. At 11:57 p.m., the air above the center ring began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The circus animals immediately arranged themselves in their circular formation, though no human had given any commands. Augustus stood on his hind legs, swaying rhythmically, as if dancing to music only he could hear. By midnight, translucent figures began materializing within the shimmer, tall, impossibly thin shapes that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially somewhere else entirely. They moved with fluid grace, their forms constantly shifting between solidity and vapor. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to be performing for an audience that existed beyond human perception, going through elaborate routines with the precision of seasoned entertainers. And there, in the center of these otherworldly performers, stood Luna herself, pale and ethereal, but unmistakably present. She raised her arms towards something suspended above, something that hurt to look at directly, something that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The missing circus hadn't vanished at all. They'd simply moved their performance to a stage that existed between worlds, entertaining an audience whose hunger could never be satisfied. But why had they been chosen? And what price were they paying for their eternal engagement in this impossible theater? The rope that had once secured Bellwether's main tent now hung slack against a broken stake, swaying in the pre-dawn breeze like a hangman's noose. Agent Cortez sketched frantically in his notebook, trying to capture details of what he'd witnessed during the midnight manifestation before rational thought could convince him it had all been hallucination. The investigation team had documented something that challenged every natural law, but their evidence would never satisfy a courtroom or convince skeptical colleagues. Dr. Blackthorn's photographic plates revealed only blurred shadows and inexplicable light patterns when developed the following morning. His instruments had registered massive electromagnetic disturbances during the apparition, but the readings defied scientific interpretation. Cortez's detailed notes described impossible geometries and figures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Observations that sounded like the ravings of a madman when read by daylight. Sheriff Morris found himself questioning his own sanity. He'd seen Luna performing with those otherworldly entities, watched the missing circus members going through elaborate routines for an audience that existed beyond human perception. But how could he explain such things to a judge, a jury, or even his own family without destroying his reputation and career? The answer to their dilemma came from an unexpected source. Silas Bellwether's private correspondence, discovered hidden beneath a false bottom in his wagon strongbox. The letters revealed a man driven by desperation rather than greed, someone who'd made increasingly dangerous bargains to keep his failing circus alive. Bellwether's Grand Traveling Circus had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years, losing performers to more successful troupes and audiences to new forms of entertainment flooding in from eastern cities. By 1898, the show existed on borrowed time and borrowed money, with creditors circling like vultures over a dying animal. From a letter dated September 15, 1898. My dearest Margaret, the Philadelphia banker demands payment by month's end or threatens seizure of all assets. I have found potential salvation in the most unlikely source, though you would think me mad for considering it. A woman approached me after our Wheeling performance, claiming knowledge of ancient methods that could grant my show powers beyond mortal entertainment. I confess the offer grows more tempting with each empty tent. The woman in question appeared to be Luna herself, though the letters suggested her association with the circus predated her official hiring as Bellwether's assistant. She'd approached him in various cities throughout the summer, always appearing when his desperation reached its peak, always offering solutions that skirted the boundaries of the possible. Luna claimed to possess knowledge inherited from her grandmother, a woman who'd supposedly learned forbidden arts from Cherokee shamans before their forced relocation. She spoke of places where the barrier between worlds grew thin, locations where skilled practitioners could access powers that would transform ordinary entertainment into genuine magic. All she required in exchange was Bellwether's agreement to perform in one specific location during the season when spiritual boundaries weakened most dramatically. Blood Creek Hollow, in late October. The correspondence revealed Bellwether's internal struggle between rational skepticism and desperate hope. He'd witnessed Luna's abilities during private demonstrations, seeing her manipulate physical objects without touching them and predict future events with unsettling accuracy. Her mysterious cabinet wasn't a stage prop, but a genuine portal, capable of accessing dimensions where different laws of physics applied. But Luna's true nature remained ambiguous even in Bellwether's private writings. He described her as simultaneously helpful and terrifying, someone who seemed to exist partially outside normal temporal flow. She aged slowly or not at all, possessed knowledge no human should have, and spoke occasionally in languages that predated written history. Most disturbing of all, Bellwether had begun to suspect that Luna's ultimate goal involved more than simply helping his circus succeed. Her interest in Blood Creek Hollow seemed connected to something larger, a purpose she carefully concealed behind offers of assistance and demonstrations of impossible abilities. From Bellwether's final letter, dated October 10th, 1898. Tomorrow we perform the ritual Luna has taught me. She promises the circus will gain audiences beyond anything I've ever imagined, though I fear the price may be higher than originally negotiated. If something should happen to me, know that I acted from love for our family and desperation for our survival, not from any desire to traffic with dark forces. The ritual Luna had designed required the entire troupe's participation, each performer playing a specific role in what she described as an invitation ceremony. They would arrange themselves in a perfect circle within the hollow's natural amphitheater, their combined spiritual energy opening a doorway to what she called the eternal theater, a dimension where the greatest performances in history continued forever, witnessed by audiences that appreciated art beyond mortal comprehension. What Luna hadn't revealed was that crossing into the eternal theater meant abandoning the physical world permanently. The performers would gain immortal audiences and supernatural abilities, but at the cost of their humanity and their connections to earthly existence. Dr. Blackthorne studied the letters with growing excitement, recognizing references to concepts he'd encountered in his psychical research. The Cherokee had indeed possessed advanced understanding of dimensional manipulation, knowledge they'd guarded jealously and shared only under extreme circumstances. If Luna truly carried such inherited wisdom, she represented a living link to shamanic traditions that predated European colonization by centuries. But Blackthorne also understood the dangers inherent in such knowledge. The Cherokee had developed elaborate protocols for safely accessing other dimensions, rituals designed to protect practitioners from entities that viewed human souls as delectable prey. Without proper safeguards, attempts to cross between worlds often resulted in death, madness, or permanent entrapment in hostile realities. Luna appeared to have deliberately omitted these protective measures from the ritual she taught Bellwether, ensuring that the circus performers would become permanently trapped in her eternal theater. But why had she orchestrated their capture? What purpose did 27 human souls serve in her larger scheme? The answer lay buried in Cherokee oral traditions that few living people remembered, stories about entities that fed on human creativity and emotion. These beings existed in dimensions adjacent to physical reality, sustained by the artistic expressions and spiritual energies of mortal performers. They'd grown weak over centuries of isolation, desperately seeking new sources of nourishment to maintain their otherworldly existence. Luna served as their agent in the mortal world, identifying talented performers who could provide the sustenance her masters required. The circus represented a perfect harvest, dozens of creative souls concentrated in one location, willing to participate in a ritual they believed would enhance their abilities rather than trap them forever. But the harvest wasn't complete. The entities Luna served required regular feeding to maintain their strength, and one circus troupe wouldn't sustain them indefinitely. She would need to find new performers, new victims, new sources of creative energy to feed the insatiable hunger of the eternal theater, which meant Luna was still out there somewhere, searching for her next group of unwitting collaborators. As November storms began lashing the Appalachian ridges, strange reports filtered in from neighboring counties. A pale woman matching Luna's description had been seen in various towns, approaching struggling performers with offers that seemed too good to be true. Traveling musicians, theater troupes, even individual artists began disappearing without explanation, leaving behind only their most precious possessions and confused witnesses who remembered little beyond a beautiful woman promising eternal audiences. The pattern was accelerating, growing bolder as Luna's confidence increased. But what happened when the local pool of performers was exhausted? Would she expand her hunting grounds to larger cities? Or had she already begun targeting victims far beyond the isolated mountain communities where her activities might go unnoticed? Frost crunched beneath the wheels of Luna's stolen wagon as she guided two liberated circus horses through the Virginia mountain passes, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the December air. Behind her lay a trail of empty performance venues and bewildered witnesses, each stop adding fresh souls to feed the insatiable appetite of the eternal theater. The pale woman had refined her methods since Blood Creek Hollow, learning to identify the perfect combination of desperation and talent that made performers vulnerable to her offers. Reports reached Sheriff Morris through a network of lawmen who'd begun sharing information about the mysterious disappearances plaguing Appalachian entertainment circuits. A string quartet in Beckley had vanished after their final performance, leaving behind instruments still warm from playing and sheet music arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. 3 traveling actors disappeared from a hotel in Lewisburg, their room found with costumes laid out as if for an imminent performance that would never begin. Each incident followed Luna's established pattern. Struggling artists contacted by a beautiful woman offering supernatural enhancement of their abilities, followed by participation in a ritual that promised eternal audiences but delivered eternal servitude. The victims always left their most precious possessions behind, suggesting they believed they were embarking on temporary journeys rather than permanent relocations to otherworldly realms. Agent Cortez had been tracking these disappearances for the Pinkerton Agency, building a case file that read like a catalog of impossibilities. His superiors grew increasingly skeptical of his reports, particularly when he began describing electromagnetic anomalies and photographic evidence of spectral phenomena. By mid-November, the agency had reassigned him to more conventional cases, but Cortez continued his investigation independently, driven by professional pride and genuine concern for Luna's potential victims. The detective's pursuit led him to Roanoke, where Luna had been spotted approaching the Virginia Opera Company during their November residency. The company's director, Giuseppe Torino, had initially dismissed her offers as the ravings of an unstable woman seeking attention. But Luna had demonstrated her abilities during a private audition, causing the theater's gas lamps to flicker in rhythm with her voice and somehow making her shadow move independently of her physical form. From Torino's private journal, November 23, 1898, the woman calling herself Luna Bellwether possesses vocal abilities that defy explanation. During her demonstration, every mirror in the theater reflected her image differently, as if she existed in multiple versions simultaneously. Despite my better judgment, I find myself considering her proposal for a special performance. Luna had evolved her recruitment strategy based on lessons learned from the circus incident. Rather than demanding entire troops participate in a ritual, She now selected specific individuals whose talents would provide the most nourishment for her otherworldly masters. A soprano whose voice could shatter crystal, a violinist whose music moved listeners to tears, a dancer whose movements seemed to defy gravity. Each possessed abilities that would translate into powerful spiritual energy when harvested by the eternal theater. But Luna's selective approach created new problems. Unlike the circus performers who'd participated willingly in what they believed was a group enhancement ritual, these individual artists often resisted her initial advances. She needed more sophisticated methods of persuasion, techniques that would overcome rational skepticism and moral objections to trafficking with supernatural forces. The solution came through what Luna called sympathetic demonstration. She would identify artists struggling with specific problems, financial difficulties, creative blocks, failing health, then offer targeted solutions that showcased her genuine abilities while building trust and dependency. A pianist with arthritic hands would find his pain mysteriously relieved after Luna's touch. A singer losing her voice due to illness would discover her range expanded beyond previous limitations following Luna's treatment. These demonstrations served dual purposes. They proved Luna's supernatural abilities while creating obligations that made refusal of her ultimate offer psychologically difficult. Artists who'd benefited from her interventions felt compelled to reciprocate when she requested their participation in more extensive rituals. Dr. Blackthorne had theorized that Luna's powers derived from her connection to the eternal theater's inhabitants, entities that could manipulate physical reality within limited parameters. Each healing, each enhancement, each impossible demonstration drew energy from her otherworldly patrons, energy that would need to be replenished through fresh offerings of human souls. This created a cycle of dependency that benefited no one except the theater's inhabitants. Luna gained access to supernatural abilities, but only by continually feeding her masters. The artists received temporary enhancements, but at the cost of their freedom and ultimately their humanity. The entities sustained themselves on creative energy, but their hunger only grew with each feeding. By December, Luna's activities had attracted attention from sources beyond local law enforcement. The American Society for Psychical Research dispatched additional investigators to document the supernatural elements of the disappearances, while the Catholic Church sent Father Michael Donnelly to assess whether the incidents represented demonic activity requiring ecclesiastical intervention. Father Donnelly approached the mystery from a theological perspective, viewing Luna as either a practitioner of forbidden arts or a victim of demonic possession. His investigation focused on the spiritual implications of her activities, particularly the ritual aspects that seemed designed to open doorways between dimensions. From his ecclesiastical training, he recognized similarities to historical accounts of practitioners who'd attempted to contact otherworldly entities through elaborate ceremonies. The priest's arrival in the affected region coincided with Luna's most ambitious recruitment effort yet, an attempt to capture the entire Richmond Symphony Orchestra during their Christmas tour of rural Virginia venues. The orchestra represented a significant escalation in Luna's activities, targeting dozens of highly trained musicians whose combined talents would provide unprecedented nourishment for the eternal theater. But orchestral musicians proved more difficult to manipulate than struggling individual artists. They possessed institutional support, professional contracts, and colleagues who would notice extended absences. Luna would need to modify her approach significantly to succeed with such a well-organized and visible target. Her solution demonstrated both cunning and escalating desperation. Rather than approaching the musicians directly, Luna began influencing their dreams, appearing in nocturnal visions that planted suggestions about supernatural enhancement of their abilities. She also began manipulating their performance venues, creating acoustic anomalies and atmospheric disturbances that made conventional musical expression feel inadequate compared to the transcendent possibilities she offered. The Dream campaign proved remarkably effective. Orchestra members began reporting similar nocturnal experiences, featuring a pale woman who promised to transform their music into something that could reach audiences beyond the physical world. Several musicians approached their conductor about incorporating experimental techniques into their repertoire, techniques that bore suspicious similarity to ritual elements Luna had used in previous captures. What would happen when Luna attempted to harvest an entire symphony orchestra? Could her otherworldly patrons absorb that much creative energy simultaneously, or would such an ambitious feeding finally reveal the true cost of her supernatural bargains? The conductor's baton snapped in half as Maestro Heinrich Zimmermann brought it down with unusual force. His face flushed crimson beneath his carefully waxed mustache. The Richmond Symphony Orchestra had been rehearsing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony for their Christmas Eve performance, but something felt fundamentally wrong with the music. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer than physics should allow, creating harmonies that existed in spaces between sound and silence. 3 weeks of strange dreams and unexplained acoustic phenomena had transformed the orchestra from disciplined professionals into a collection of increasingly agitated artists. Desperate for musical transcendence, they couldn't define. Luna's influence had spread through the ensemble like a contagion, though few musicians consciously recognized her manipulation. First violinist Margaret Ashford complained of hearing additional instruments during their performances, phantom strings, and woodwinds that played countermelodies she couldn't identify or ignore. Cellist Robert Morrison reported that his instrument had begun producing overtones that seemed to originate from somewhere other than the strings themselves. The orchestra's performances had grown increasingly powerful and unsettling. Audiences left their concerts feeling emotionally drained yet strangely exhilarated, as if they'd experienced something beyond conventional musical entertainment. Several patrons reported continued hearing the symphony's music for days after performances ended, melodies that played in their minds with supernatural persistence. Father Donnelly attended their December 15th concert in Winchester, documenting phenomena that confirmed his worst fears about Luna's activities. During the performance, shadows on the concert hall walls moved independently of their sources, while candles in wall sconces flickered in patterns that matched the musical rhythms. Most disturbing of all, he observed translucent figures gathered in the theater's upper balconies, otherworldly audience members who seemed to feed on the music's emotional resonance. From Father Donnelly's report to Cardinal Gibbons, December 16, 1898. The musicians appear to be unknowing conduits for supernatural forces. Their performance creates doorways between dimensions, allowing entities of questionable nature to access our physical realm. Immediate intervention may be required to prevent complete spiritual compromise of the ensemble. Agent Cortez had been tracking Luna's movements through Virginia, following reports of her appearances at various venues along the symphony's tour route. He'd managed to photograph her outside the Winchester Concert Hall, though the developed images showed only a pale blur surrounded by inexplicable light distortions. His attempts to approach her directly had failed. She seemed capable of detecting his presence from considerable distances and would vanish before he could get close enough for questioning. The detective's investigation had revealed Luna's increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. Rather than relying solely on supernatural demonstration, she'd begun studying her target's personal histories and vulnerabilities. She knew that Margaret Ashford had lost her hearing in her left ear during childhood and offered to restore it completely. She understood that Robert Morrison struggled with arthritis that threatened to end his career and promised permanent relief from pain. Each offer was precisely calibrated to exploit the recipient's deepest fears and desires, making refusal psychologically difficult despite rational skepticism about Luna's claims. She'd learned to present herself as a solution to problems the musicians had lived with for years, creating emotional leverage that traditional logic couldn't overcome. But Luna's most insidious tactic involved her manipulation of the orchestra's collective artistic identity. She convinced them that conventional musical performance was a pale shadow of what music could achieve when enhanced by supernatural forces. Their growing dissatisfaction with normal concerts drove them to seek the transcendent experiences she offered, even when such experiences came with prices they couldn't fully comprehend. The symphony's Christmas Eve concert in Staunton was scheduled to be Luna's harvest moment. She'd arranged for the performance to take place in an abandoned church whose consecrated ground had been deliberately desecrated through rituals she'd performed during previous visits. The building's spiritual corruption would amplify the portal-opening effects of the musician's enhanced performance, allowing her otherworldly patrons to access the physical dimension more completely than ever before. Dr. Blackthorne had arrived in Staunton 3 days before the concert, bringing equipment designed to detect and potentially disrupt dimensional anomalies. His instruments registered massive electromagnetic disturbances throughout the abandoned church, readings that suggested the building existed partially in multiple realities simultaneously. The air itself felt thick and oppressive, charged with energies that made sensitive individuals nauseated or disoriented. Local residents had begun reporting strange phenomena associated with the upcoming concert. Children spoke of hearing music coming from the abandoned church at all hours, melodies that seemed to play themselves without instruments or performers. Several adults claimed to see lights moving through the building's broken windows, patterns that suggested the presence of entities preparing for some significant event. The Staunton Town Council had grown sufficiently concerned to request assistance from state authorities, but their appeals were dismissed as rural superstition by officials who hadn't witnessed Luna's abilities firsthand. Only a small group of investigators and clergy understood the true danger posed by the Christmas Eve performance, and their resources seemed inadequate to prevent what Luna had been orchestrating for months. As December 24th approached, the Richmond Symphony Orchestra made final preparations for what they believed would be the most transcendent performance of their careers. They had no idea they were actually rehearsing for their permanent departure from the physical world, their souls destined to join the growing collection of artists feeding the eternal theater's insatiable audience. But Luna had made one crucial mistake in her careful planning. She'd underestimated the power of human connections that extended beyond individual artistic ambition, bonds that could potentially anchor the musicians to physical reality even when supernatural forces attempted to drag them into otherworldly dimensions. Would love prove stronger than Luna's supernatural manipulation, or had she finally assembled enough creative energy to satisfy her master's hunger permanently? Candle wax dripped like frozen tears onto the abandoned church's rotting floorboards as the Richmond Symphony Orchestra assembled for their Christmas Eve performance. Unaware that each musician carried a soul price, Luna had already negotiated with otherworldly buyers. The December wind howled through broken stained glass windows, creating discordant harmonies that seemed to mock the concept of sacred music. This would be the night when months of careful manipulation finally bore fruit, delivering dozens of creative souls to feed the eternal theater's ravenous appetite. Father Donnelly crouched behind the church's collapsed altar, clutching holy relics and muttering prayers in Latin, while Dr. Blackthorne calibrated instruments designed to measure dimensional instability. Agent Cortez had positioned himself near the building's main entrance, though he harbored little hope that conventional law enforcement could stop what was about to unfold. The three men represented humanity's only defense against Luna's harvest, their resources pathetically inadequate against supernatural forces they barely understood. The musicians began tuning their instruments at 7:45 p.m. Their usual pre-performance ritual transformed into something resembling an invocation. Each note they played seemed to hang in the frigid air longer than physics should allow, creating harmonies that existed in spaces between sound and silence. Margaret Ashford noticed that her violin strings vibrated sympathetically with tones no one was producing, as if invisible instruments were joining their preparation. Luna appeared precisely at 8 o'clock, materializing from shadows that seemed deeper than December darkness should create. She wore a flowing white gown that moved independently of any breeze. Her pale skin, luminous in the candlelight like polished bone. The musicians welcomed her presence with relief rather than suspicion, their months of dream manipulation having conditioned them to view her as a benevolent guide rather than a predatory harvester. Tonight, Luna announced in a voice that carried undertones of vast distances, "Your music will reach audiences beyond mortal comprehension. You will perform for listeners who have waited centuries to hear true artistry, beings who understand beauty in ways human minds cannot grasp." She gestured toward the church's vaulted ceiling, where shadows had begun moving with purposeful intent, coalescing into forms that hurt to observe directly. The otherworldly audience was already assembling, drawn by the promise of creative sustenance they'd been denied for too long. Maestro Zimmerman raised his baton, completely unaware that he was conducting more than just an orchestra. Each musician had become a conduit for forces that existed beyond physical reality, their enhanced abilities purchased through Luna's negotiations with entities that viewed human souls as currency in transactions spanning multiple dimensions. The opening movement began with Beethoven's familiar themes, but the music quickly transformed into something the composer never intended. Additional instruments seemed to join the performance: phantom strings and woodwinds that played counter-melodies originating from empty air. The sound grew impossibly complex, layered with harmonies that human ears could barely process. Dr. Blackthorn's instruments registered electromagnetic readings that defied scientific explanation. The abandoned church existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, each version slightly different, all connected by the bridge the musician's enhanced performance was creating. Temperature fluctuations created visible distortions in the air, while his specialized cameras captured luminous phenomena that writhed through the space like living things. As the performance intensified, the musicians began showing signs of the price Luna had negotiated on their behalf. Margaret Ashford's restored hearing allowed her to perceive sounds from otherworldly sources, but the sensation felt like ice picks driven into her brain. Robert Morrison's arthritis had vanished completely, but his hands moved with mechanical precision that seemed controlled by external forces rather than conscious will. The otherworldly audience grew more substantial with each passing moment, feeding on the creative energy the performance generated. They appeared as tall, impossibly thin figures, whose faces shifted between expressions of ecstasy and hunger, being sustained by artistic expression but capable of consuming the artists themselves if properly motivated. Father Donnelly recognized the moment when intervention became necessary. As the symphony reached its climactic passages, cracks began appearing in the church walls, not physical damage, but ruptures in reality itself that allowed more entities to pour through from adjacent dimensions. If the performance continued much longer, the barrier between worlds would collapse completely, flooding physical reality with beings whose very existence threatened human sanity. The priest emerged from his hiding place, raising a silver crucifix that gleamed with reflected candlelight. His voice boomed across the supernatural symphony as he began the ritual of exorcism, words in ecclesiastical Latin that carried power accumulated over centuries of faith and sacrifice. In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti, he chanted, his voice somehow audible above the impossible music. I command the unclean spirits to depart from these servants of God. Luna whirled toward him, her beautiful facade dissolving to reveal something ancient and predatory underneath. Her true form flickered between human appearance and geometric patterns that existed in too many dimensions simultaneously, while her voice became a harmony of tones that suggested vast spaces filled with screaming wind. But Father Donnelly's intervention had created a moment of spiritual clarity that allowed some musicians to recognize their predicament. Margaret Ashford's love for her absent children provided an anchor strong enough to resist Luna's control, while Robert Morrison's memories of his deceased wife generated emotional power that supernatural manipulation couldn't override. These human connections Love, memory, sacrifice created countercurrents in the spiritual energy Luna was harvesting, disrupting the careful balance her ritual required. The otherworldly audience began showing signs of distress, their feeding interrupted by chaotic fluctuations in the creative power they were attempting to consume. As the battle between supernatural and human forces reached its crescendo, one crucial question remained unanswered. Were the bonds connecting the musicians to physical reality strong enough to overcome months of careful conditioning, or would Luna's harvest succeed despite last-minute interference? The abandoned church trembled on the edge between dimensions, while dozens of souls hung in the balance. The silver crucifix blazed with impossible light as Father Donnelly pressed forward through air that had grown thick as honey, each step a battle against forces that sought to drag him into the spaces between dimensions. Around him, the Richmond Symphony Orchestra fought their own war, some musicians clinging to memories of loved ones, while others surrendered to Luna's otherworldly symphony that promised transcendence at the cost of their humanity. This was the moment when the barrier between realities grew thin enough to shatter, when choices made in desperation would determine whether dozens of souls joined the eternal theater or found their way back to the world they'd almost abandoned. Margaret Ashford's violin strings snapped one by one as she played with increasing desperation, her restored hearing allowing her to perceive the true horror of what surrounded them. The otherworldly audience wasn't simply listening to their performance. They were feeding on it, drawing sustenance from the musician's creative energy with an appetite that could never be satisfied. Each note played strengthened the entities while weakening the performers, a transaction Luna had negotiated without revealing its ultimate cost. But Margaret's connection to her children provided an anchor that supernatural manipulation couldn't sever. Images of her daughter's first piano recital, memories of teaching her son to whistle simple melodies, the weight of maternal love accumulated over years of sacrifice. These human experiences generated power that flowed counter to Luna's careful design. Robert Morrison felt similar resistance as his memories of his deceased wife Sarah flooded back with startling clarity. She died giving birth to their stillborn child 3 years earlier, but her love had never faded from his heart. The cello sang with grief, transformed into defiance, as he played not for Luna's otherworldly patrons, but for the woman who'd believed his music could heal any sorrow. Other musicians found their own sources of strength. The French horn player remembered his father teaching him to read music by candlelight during the war. The timpanist thought of students whose faces lit up when they finally mastered difficult pieces. The flutist drew power from her sister's courage in leaving an abusive marriage, finding freedom through decisions that required tremendous personal risk. These individual acts of resistance created chaos in Luna's carefully orchestrated ritual. The spiritual energy she'd been harvesting began fluctuating wildly, feeding her otherworldly patrons inconsistently and leaving them increasingly agitated. Some entities began turning on each other, their hunger driving them to seek sustenance from fellow creatures rather than waiting for the human performers to provide adequate nourishment. Dr. Blackthorn's instruments registered massive dimensional instabilities as reality itself began buckling under the strain of conflicting forces. The abandoned church existed simultaneously in multiple versions, some where Luna's ritual succeeded completely, others where it failed catastrophically, all bleeding into each other through cracks that widened with each passing moment. Agent Cortez had been documenting the supernatural battle from his position near the entrance, his camera capturing images that would never be believed by rational observers. But as the dimensional barriers weakened, he found himself pulled into the conflict directly. His detective's training in reading human nature allowed him to perceive patterns in the chaos, weaknesses in Luna's control that could potentially be exploited. The pale woman stood in the center of the maelstrom, her form flickering between human appearance and something far more alien. She raised her arms toward the otherworldly audience, attempting to maintain control over forces that were growing beyond her ability to direct. For the first time since Blood Creek Hollow, Luna appeared vulnerable, powerful, but not omnipotent, cunning, but not infallible. "You chose this," she screamed at the resisting musicians, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast distances and endless hunger. "I offered you transcendence, audiences beyond mortal dreams. Why do you cling to a world that has given you nothing but struggle and mediocrity?" Father Donnelly pressed closer, his prayers creating visible distortions in the supernatural atmosphere. "Because struggle gives meaning to triumph," he called back, his voice somehow carrying above the impossible music. "Because love shared with mortal hearts burns brighter than eternal performance for creatures who know only hunger." The priest's words seemed to catalyze something in the musicians' collective consciousness. They'd spent months being told that their normal audiences weren't worthy of their talents, that only supernatural beings could truly appreciate their artistry. But Luna's otherworldly patrons appreciated nothing. They simply consumed, leaving nothing behind but emptiness where beauty had once existed. As this realization spread through the orchestra, their performance began changing again. Instead of the complex, alien harmonies Luna had taught them, they returned to Beethoven's original themes music, written by a human for humans, expressing emotions and experiences that belonged to physical reality rather than otherworldly dimensions. The shift in musical focus created corresponding changes in the spiritual energy flowing through the abandoned church. Where Luna's enhanced performance had opened doorways between dimensions, the return to human-centered artistry began closing them again. The otherworldly audience found their access to creative sustenance increasingly restricted, forcing them to retreat toward whatever realm they'd originally inhabited. But Luna wouldn't surrender her harvest easily. As her control over the musicians weakened, she began drawing power directly from the dimensional rifts her ritual had created, transforming herself into something more dangerous than ever before. Her human facade dissolved completely, revealing a geometric entity that existed in spaces between realities, sustained by creative energy stolen from multiple dimensions. The final confrontation would determine not just the fate of the Richmond Symphony Orchestra, but the integrity of the barriers separating human reality from realms where artistic expression had been corrupted into something far more sinister. In the mountains around Staunton, locals reported hearing phantom music drifting from the abandoned church melodies that seemed to play themselves, growing stronger as midnight approached on Christmas Eve, as if the very stones remembered performances that spanned multiple worlds and refused to let them end. The ancient wood of Margaret Ashford's violin bow ignited with sudden flame as she drew it across her remaining string, the fire spreading through her instrument like divine judgment, while her music rang pure and defiant against Luna's geometric horror. In that moment of willing sacrifice, choosing to destroy her most precious possession, rather than let it serve otherworldly hunger, she created a resonance that would shatter dimensional barriers and seal Luna's fate forever. The choice between human love and supernatural transcendence had been made, but its consequences would ripple through reality itself with unprecedented force. Luna's transformed state collapsed inward as Margaret's blazing violin sent waves of purified sound through the abandoned church. The pale woman's geometric form, all angles, and impossible mathematics began losing coherence as the barriers between dimensions snapped back into place with thunderous finality. Her otherworldly patrons found themselves severed from their source of creative sustenance, trapped in adjacent realities, while their human prey escaped through courage born of genuine connection. Father Donnelly's prayers reached crescendo as the church walls stopped their dimensional trembling. His silver crucifix had grown so hot it burned his palms, but he held fast until the last supernatural entity retreated to whatever realm had spawned them. The priest would carry permanent scars from that Christmas Eve, marks that reminded him daily of battles fought in spaces between faith and madness. Dr. Blackthorn's instruments registered the moment when reality stabilized, electromagnetic readings returning to normal ranges as his cameras captured the final dissolution of otherworldly phenomena. His photographic plates would show only empty air, where impossible geometries had writhed moments before, evidence that would frustrate him for the remainder of his career in psychical research. But three musicians paid the ultimate price for their collective salvation. The first violinist, who'd surrendered completely to Luna's promises, found himself trapped between dimensions, his soul anchored to neither world. The oboist, whose cynicism had made him vulnerable to supernatural manipulation, aged 40 years, in 40 seconds, his hair turning white as his body processed the cost of trafficking with entities that existed beyond mortal time. The second cellist simply faded from existence, remembered by his colleagues but leaving no trace in any official record, as if he'd never been born. Agent Cortez documented these losses in reports that would never see publication, filed away in Pinkerton archives alongside other cases that challenged rational explanation. 24 musicians survived Luna's harvest, but they carried psychological scars that would influence their music for the rest of their lives. Their performances gained depth and emotional resonance that critics attributed to artistic maturation, never suspecting the supernatural experiences that had forged such profound understanding of beauty's true cost. Margaret Ashford never played violin again after that Christmas Eve. Her hands retained their skill, but she couldn't bear to hold instruments that reminded her of the choice between maternal love and otherworldly transcendence. Instead, she became a teacher, passing down musical knowledge while carefully omitting the darker lessons she'd learned about creativity's potential for corruption. Robert Morrison continued his career, but developed a reputation for pieces that could move audiences to tears with their emotional intensity. Critics praised his supernatural ability to channel grief into beauty, never realizing how literally accurate their descriptions had become. He died in 1923. His final performance, a solo that witnesses swore contained harmonies no single instrument could produce. Luna's ultimate fate remained a mystery that would puzzle investigators for decades. Some claimed she'd been destroyed when the dimensional barrier snapped closed, her existence too dependent on otherworldly connections to survive in purely physical reality. Others insisted she'd simply retreated to plan new harvests, waiting for humanity to forget the lessons learned in that abandoned Virginia church. The truth lay somewhere between these theories. Luna had been severely weakened by the ritual's failure, her connection to the eternal theater damaged but not completely severed. She withdrew to remote locations where the barrier between worlds remained naturally thin, places where patient cultivation might eventually restore her powers to their previous levels. Mountain folk throughout Appalachia began reporting encounters with a pale woman who appeared near isolated performance venues, always during seasons when reality felt most fragile. She would watch from shadows while local musicians played, her presence creating subtle distortions that made simple songs sound haunted by impossible longing. But Luna had learned caution from her failure in Staunton. Instead of attempting large-scale harvests, she began collecting individual performers, one lonely fiddler here, one wandering singer there, building her strength gradually while avoiding the attention that had previously led to organized resistance. The Richmond Symphony Orchestra disbanded 6 months after their Christmas Eve ordeal, its members scattering to positions with other ensembles throughout the country. They maintained correspondence for several years, sharing news and offering mutual support as they processed their shared trauma. But gradually, the letters stopped coming as distance and time dulled memories that had once felt impossibly vivid. Only Father Donnelly continued monitoring supernatural activity throughout the region, his ecclesiastical duties expanding to include investigations of phenomena that challenged church doctrine. He established a network of rural priests trained to recognize signs of otherworldly manipulation, creating an early warning system for future encounters with entities like Luna and her patrons. The abandoned church in Staunton was torn down in 1905 after multiple reports of phantom music and unexplained lights. But workers discovered that the building's foundation stones had been carved with symbols that predated European settlement, Cherokee markings similar to those found around Blood Creek Hollow. The discovery suggested that Luna hadn't chosen her harvest locations randomly. She'd been following ancient maps to places where the barrier between worlds had always been fragile. Years later, folklorists would collect stories about the Phantom Concert from elderly residents who'd lived through the events of 1898. The tales grew increasingly elaborate with each retelling, transforming supernatural horror into campfire entertainment that thrilled children while teaching them to respect mysteries that existed beyond rational understanding. But on certain Christmas Eves, when winter wind howls through Appalachian hollows with particular intensity, locals still report hearing orchestral music drifting from empty spaces where abandoned buildings once stood. The melodies sound beautiful, but heartbreaking, as if performed by musicians trapped between joy and sorrow, forever seeking audiences who can appreciate art without consuming the artists who create it. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.